when you look at the history of incarcerated populations, there's always an uptick in incarcerated veterans after wars. And right now we're going through an uptick of incarcerated veterans as we escalate down from Afghanistan and Iraq. And this all has to do with issues, if you go back in time. For instance, San Quentin actually began post-Civil War. Originally, it was a barge off of San Quentin Point, which is in a bay in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then the incarcerated population became so big that they had to build a building. And so the first building of San Quentin State Prison was shortly after the Civil War. And a lot of it had to do with the issue of veterans returning from active service who have a really difficult time reintegrating into society. And as part of that difficulty of reintegrating into society, they're dealing with issues of self-control, lack of self-control. They're dealing with issues of not feeling like they really belong back into society. And what happens particularly, oftentimes, they're issues that are related to violence and acts of violence. So right now we're seeing, particularly I can see it specifically at San Quentin, but I'm also aware of it because I've been involved in other yoga for veterans who are incarcerated. But right now we're seeing it so that probably I'd say anywhere from 9 to 10% of the incarcerated population in the United States are veterans right now. One more thing I'll add to that. If you look at who are the people who work, who are correctional officers who work in corrections, and I would venture to say, I've never seen a study done on this, but I would venture to say that half of correctional officers in the United States are military veterans.
I wouldn't doubt that. Yeah.
So you've got, and this is somewhat new for us. I mean, it's not new that we have not understood it, but it's new in that we're starting to direct focus on providing services for correctional officers and understanding that they come from the same kind of backgrounds of complex trauma, be it developmental trauma, complex trauma, the secondary trauma, the trauma that they're experiencing from the work that they do. And so why wouldn't we, from an equanimity standpoint of yoga, why wouldn't we be providing services for correctional staff as well as for incarcerated people in truly taking a holistic approach?
I think that's really important that you bring that up. And it goes back to even with us working in the VA centers or the VA hospitals, and even in the hospital, I work actually at a medical hospital working with active duty servicemen and women, training the staff that are working with the, I don't want to say the students, but the patients that are suffering from war trauma. I think it's when you're having issues with self-regulation and not being able to cope, and that isolation and disconnection, and not really at times being able to function.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I had an opportunity to start a yoga program at San Quentin, and it was with a group of veterans, incarcerated veterans. It was led by a former Marine Corps captain who had been a special ops person, really interesting man, who started a program called Veterans Healing Veterans from the Inside, meaning from the inside being incarcerated, out. So what can we do as veterans? Because what he had discovered was that incarcerated veterans did not want to sit in a room doing cognitive behavioral therapy work with non-veterans. They wanted to be with other veterans to do their work. And there was a certain resistance to even doing that. But being introduced to it by a veteran, and particularly an officer who started with narrative therapy. So talking about and writing about the trauma that they experienced from their active duty. And when he started the program, he said, "Hey, Fox, you know what? I'd like to involve a yoga program with this." And I thought, whoa, that's a really big step for you to understand that. And he said, no, I understand that we really need to include the body with this. One of the things that came out of the narrative therapy that was shared with me, because he invited me, anytime you want to sit in on our narrative therapy group, please do so, which of course is of great value to me because it informs the way that I'm going to lead the yoga practice. But one of the things that came out of the yoga, the narrative therapy, was their trauma began before their active military service. That almost to a person, they came from backgrounds of developmental trauma and complex trauma, and perhaps even as kind of an out of stepping out of that history, they joined the military.
Yep.
And then what happens is they join the military and then they drop into a traumatic environment, right? And there's a similarity in terms of, okay, you look at incarcerated people. They come from a background of developmental trauma, complex trauma. They engage in a criminal lifestyle, so then they bring on more trauma to themselves, which leads to criminality. So there are definitely some parallels, and it really opened my eyes the fact that incarcerated people's trauma did not initiate from their active duty.
A lot of times it really does not. I mean, sometimes we have the combat-related trauma, but other times you're completely right that I see often that something happens in childhood. They want to leave where they grew up to almost escape, if you will, to go into the military, and then something happens there and they come back a completely changed person. And you're dealing with several deployments, which in today's military, they're deploying a lot. It's not just one every so often. It's constant, which is not normal. I mean, imagine being, taken away from your family for months at a time. And sometimes you don't even know exactly how long that's going to be, or, and that's the same with incarceration. It's
Same thing.
lengths at a time. But one thing you did say about military wanting to be with military, not civilians, is the people that I work with are generally voluntold they have to come to yoga. And we have to do yoga. But one thing that keeps them together is that they're experiencing this together. And they can joke and carry on and still keep it. And they're not with one, it's Navy, Marines, Air Force, it's all of them together. And you hear that bantering back and forth constantly, which is great. I don't know whether you have that.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I remembered when we first started the class, and this guy who had started Veterans Healing Veterans said, okay, James, this is how we roll. Each guy introduces himself and says the branch of service that he came from. And we were in a oval, and each guy would say their branch of service, and another guy would say, oh, yeah, Army, okay. And it came around to, I'm Air Force, I'm Marines, I'm Navy, and so on. But the bonding among veterans, which I thought was a real positive thing in terms of they're doing time together. And they also realize, okay, we share something in common. That there's a strength to that. We share in common that we served our country, which always kind of blew my mind. It's like, yeah, you guys served your country, but then you ended up in prison, but you're still very proud of the fact that you served your country, and you bound together around that service and having each other's backs. Like one of the things they always said was "no man left behind,"
That's
which
true.
they said a lot. And you don't hear that among your average incarcerated person. You don't hear that at all. It's much more of a me, me, me.
It's commonality. And I know even in the Marines, it's, once a Marine, always a Marine.